There's a fault line running under downtown Seattle right now that scientists say could produce a magnitude 7 earthquake with almost zero warning. And there's another one under Salt Lake City that hasn't moved in 350 years, which means it's absolutely overdue. And then there's the one most people have never heard of, the one that could trigger the single most destructive earthquake event in American history. And it's not in California. We're going state by state through the most dangerous fault line, hiding under every single one of them. Some of these you know, most of these you don't. The Saline Creek Fault Zone in North Alabama doesn't get press, but it's sitting inside the extended influence of the New Madrid seismic zone, one of the most dangerous fault systems in the country. We'll come back to New Madrid. It deserves its own moment. Let's not bury the lead. Alaska has the Denali Fault, a 1,200-mile slash across the state that produced a magnitude 7.9 earthquake in 2002. That quake ruptured 209 miles of surface in 3 minutes. It was so powerful it liquefied ground in Louisiana 3,000 miles away. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline crosses it 58 times. Engineers actually built flexible joints into the pipeline for exactly this reason. They knew. They planned. But knowing and surviving are two different things. The Hurricane Fault in the western part of the state sits directly beneath several growing communities near St. George. It's a normal fault, the kind that drops the ground instead of sliding it. Geologists say it has produced magnitude 7 earthquakes and will again. The New Madrid seismic zone clips Arkansas hard. In 1811 and 1812, this fault system produced 4 earthquakes that were so massive they rang church bells in Boston. The Mississippi River reportedly flowed backward for 3 days. And here's the insane part. The entire central U.S. is geologically cold and rigid, which means seismic waves travel farther here. A major New Madrid quake today could cause structural damage in 15 states simultaneously. Everyone says San Andreas, but the most dangerous fault in California right now might actually be the Hayward Fault, a 74-mile rupture running directly through Oakland, Berkeley, and Fremont. 2.5 million people live on or near it. BART trains run across it. Schools, hospitals, fire stations built directly on it. The USGS calls it one of the most urbanized active faults in the world. In 1868, it produced a magnitude 6.8. Scientists say it's fully capable of a 7.0, and it's running 140 years overdue. The Mosquito Fault near Leadville is dramatic, but the real threat is the Cherokee Fault in southeastern. It moved as recently as 7,000 years ago yesterday in geological time, and could produce a 7.0 that would be completely unexpected. Colorado has no real earthquake culture. Nobody's prepared. The eastern Connecticut seismic zone is older and less active, but New England bedrock transmits seismic energy incredibly efficiently. A moderate quake here hits Boston, Hartford, and Providence all at once. Delaware sits within the influence of the Ramapo Fault System, one of the most debated fault systems in the Northeast. Geologists spent decades arguing about whether it was even active. Then it produced a 5.1 in 2011 that shook 20 states. That wasn't a fluke. Florida has no significant active faults. The peninsula is geologically stable. But don't feel too safe down there. Florida is uniquely vulnerable to fault-triggered tsunamis originating in the Caribbean. The state has no topographic protection. A 7.0 off Puerto Rico generates a wave, and there is nowhere for South Florida to go. The Charleston seismic zone. In 1886, Charleston, South Carolina was hit by a magnitude 7.3 earthquake that killed over 100 people and destroyed most of the city's buildings. For context, this is the most powerful earthquake to ever strike the eastern U.S. in recorded history. Most Americans have no idea it happened. The fault that caused it is still there, still active, still unmapped in detail. The Kawiki Fault System on the Big Island runs directly through the flank of Kilauea. In 1975, it generated a 7.2 that dropped portions of the coastline by 11 feet in seconds. A larger collapse of Kilauea's south flank, which sits on a fault that creeps downslope every year, would send tens of millions of cubic meters of rock into the ocean and generate a Pacific-wide tsunami. The Lost River Fault produced the 1983 Bora Peak earthquake, a 6.9 that cracked the surface of the Earth for 36 miles. Bora Peak, the tallest mountain in Idaho, rose 8 inches. The valley floor dropped 7 feet in a day. The fault cuts through an increasingly populated corridor near Sun Valley. All of these sit in the New Madrid kill zone. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates there's a 25 to 40% probability of a magnitude 6.0 or greater in the next 50 years, and around a 7 to 10% chance of a major 7.5 event. Memphis sits directly on the zone. The city's building stock is old, unreinforced brick. Water mains would rupture. Bridges over the Mississippi, some of the busiest freight corridors in the country, would collapse. FEMA has modeled this scenario. Their own estimates say it would be the most economically devastating natural disaster in U.S. history. Not one of the worst. The worst. These states feel earthquake immune. They're not anymore. Induced seismicity from oil and gas operations, specifically wastewater injection, has triggered hundreds of earthquakes in both states in recent years. The prehistoric Humboldt Fault in Kansas hasn't produced a major natural event in millennia. But nobody knows if all that induced activity is waking something up. The Intermountain Seismic Belt cuts through western Montana, and in 1959, the Hebgen Lake Fault let go in a magnitude 7.3. It triggered a landslide that buried a campground in 80 million tons of rock. A lake formed overnight. The quake was felt in 9 states. Landslide debris still dams the river today. The Walker Lane Seismic Belt runs through Nevada and into California, and it may be the future boundary of a tectonic plate. A magnitude 7.7 in Pleasant Valley in 1915 dropped the valley floor by nearly 20 feet along a fault most people had never heard of. And Reno, a city that has exploded in population, sits directly inside this belt. Here's where things get terrifying. Oregon's most dangerous fault isn't a fault in the traditional sense. It's the Cascadia Subduction Zone, a 600-mile-long boundary where the Juan de Fuca Plate is being shoved under North America. It last ruptured fully in 1700, producing a magnitude 9.0. Scientists know this because the tsunami reached Japan, and they have written records of it. The Pacific Northwest has a 10 to 15% chance of another full rupture in the next 50 years. When it goes, the Oregon coast will drop 3 to 6 feet in seconds. Every bridge on Highway 101 will likely be destroyed. FEMA's planning document describes the event as beyond the response capability of any existing system, the Wasatch Fault. Salt Lake City is a modern American metro of 1.2 million people, and it's built directly on a fault that has produced magnitude 7 earthquakes roughly every 350 years. The last major event was somewhere between 350 and 400 years ago. You do the math. The Utah Geological Survey has concluded that a major Wasatch event would kill thousands, destroy tens of thousands of buildings, and cut off the Salt Lake Valley from the rest of the country for days. Unlike Portland or Seattle, Salt Lake City has no major evacuation routes that don't cross the fault itself. In 2011, a 5.8 hit mineral, Virginia, the largest earthquake to strike the eastern U.S. since 1944. It damaged the Washington Monument, cracked the National Cathedral, and was felt from Canada to Georgia. The source was an ancient fault in Proterozoic basement rock. Ancient doesn't mean dead. The Seattle Fault Zone runs directly under downtown, under the stadiums, under the waterfront. A magnitude 7.0 here doesn't just flatten buildings. It triggers submarine landslides in Puget Sound that send a local tsunami into the Seattle waterfront within minutes. The 1700 Cascadia quake also triggered this exact scenario. Scientists believe a giant wave buried parts of the current Seattle shoreline that year. Yellowstone. The Yellowstone caldera is the largest volcanic system in North America, and the fault systems inside it are unlike anything else on this list. A 7.3 struck Yellowstone in 1959, but the bigger concern is what sits underneath, a magma chamber the size of Rhode Island. The caldera erupts on a cycle of roughly 600,000 years. The last eruption was 640,000 years ago. You can figure out the rest. So here's the thing. Every single state on this list has one fault that's been quiet long enough for people to forget it exists. And geologists will tell you the same thing every time faults don't die. They sleep. And the most dangerous moment isn't when they're active. It's the moment just before they wake up. Speaking of things that are long overdue, if you want to know which U.S. cities are the most geologically unprepared for what's coming, I promise some of the answers are going to surprise you.